Do you know what a nightmare truly is? You know that phenomenon experienced during sleep where you partially wake up, but feel like you aren't completely awake? In folklore, this is said to be caused by demons, but medically, it is known as sleep paralysis. No matter how much you want to, you cannot move. You feel short of breath, unable to inhale deeply. You want to speak, shout, or scream, but you cannot succeed. You see everything around you, but even if you wanted to, you couldn't escape. Luckily, this state lasts a maximum of 1 or 2 minutes. Then you wake up. Now, imagine this lasting for years. What if you could never wake up? The year is 1988. Living in South Africa, 12-year-old Martin Pistorius had fallen ill with a disease no one could understand. First, his voice slowly faded, then strangely he became unable to speak at all. He stopped eating and fell into a constant state of sleep. No matter how much the doctors investigated, they couldn't diagnose the cause of what was happening. Young Martin was wasting away before everyone's eyes, but nobody knew what was wrong. His illness, or whatever it was, progressed so rapidly that within months, Martin was confined to a wheelchair. Despite countless tests, no definitive diagnosis could be made. There were only assumptions. As such, unfortunately, in a short period like 18 months, he could no longer speak or feed himself. He had become completely dependent on care. In the end, the helpless physicians, though unable to give a precise medical diagnosis, told the family the bitter truth. Martin had mentally regressed to the level of a baby. He was now a permanently paralyzed, bedridden patient. He had entered a state similar to a deep coma. From the outside, there was a body in a sleep-like state that gave no reaction. Meaning he wasn't dead, but he wasn't living either. In the doctor's words, he was showing signs of a vegetative state. So much so that over the passing years he couldn't move, speak, nor give any reaction to his surroundings. Martin had turned into a vegetable that just stared straight into the void, only moving his eyes. Doctors told the grieving family that their son would likely never wake up again and didn't have much time left. According to them, Martin was no longer there, and his body was wasting away day by day. According to estimates, he might live perhaps 2 more years. Of course, there was a family in shock, facing this situation in pain, not knowing what was happening or what to do. Therefore, since constant home care didn't seem possible, Martin, with the doctor's recommendation, was placed in a special care center for disabled children. His parents worked during the day. At night, they went to stay by Martin's side. Watching their only son waste away before their eyes every day naturally wounded them deeply. As the years progressed, the despair they were in grew and their hopes ran out. Their son, whom doctors gave 2 years to live, hadn't died, but he hadn't woken up either. So, they began to believe that Martin was truly gone, or so they thought. About 2 or 3 years had passed. But while Martin's body remained unresponsive, a completely different reality started to emerge inside. Approximately 2 years after entering a full coma, his consciousness slowly began to stir, or whatever you want to call it, it began to open up. And this return was like light gradually illuminating the horizon at dawn. Meaning it happened very indistinctly. It wasn't like waking up from a deep sleep all at once, but rather like awareness was developing slowly. Of course, even if he opened and closed his eyes, that was it. His gaze still looked empty, and his body wouldn't obey even the slightest command. As this started happening, meaning as Martin's consciousness returned, he found himself in an unimaginable nightmare. The people around him were essentially blind and deaf to his existence. They spoke beside him, moved around, but acted as if Martin wasn't there. Inside his body, which was placed motionlessly in a bed or wheelchair, Martin was screaming. He was begging for help from the inside. But not a single whisper came out. He didn't know what was happening to him. It was as if he had fallen into an endless nightmare. His arms and legs were no longer his. He couldn't control them, and worse, his voice was completely lost too. The awakened mind inside was imprisoned by his lifeless body. Furthermore, after this awakening, unfortunately for a very long time, no one would realize that he had woken up, or that his consciousness had returned. Martin had now become an invisible observer of the world around him. People had their most private conversations next to him. They carried on their daily business without caring about his presence, treating him like an object. While at the care home, since those around him thought he couldn't hear, everyone acted incredibly relaxed. One of the staff would think they were alone in the room and sing loudly. Another would practice a runway walk in front of the mirror. Some would comfortably pass gas and talk to themselves, thinking no one would hear anyway. He was an invisible witness. While life around him flowed by, no one noticed anymore that he was a real person. And the attitudes, of course, were not always this tragically funny. After all, he was a trinket made of flesh and bone. Hitting him, cursing at him, or even doing very, very unpleasant things wouldn't cause any harm, right? Let me tell you something more painful. Martin's body wasn't completely numb, meaning his pain receptors were still alive. So, when a nurse got angry while changing him and slapped him, yes, he felt it, but he couldn't react. When a caregiver feeding him spilled the food and Martin ended up getting beaten for it, he was the victim again. Yet he couldn't move. Could the mistake be his? But if a culprit was to be found, of course, it was Martin, who couldn't move, who suffered but couldn't speak, who essentially had a mouth but no tongue. These things happened and they would stay hidden forever. For Martin, however, the most painful part wasn't these events. Yes, what more could it be, right? But it wasn't that. It was one night when his mother and father were arguing again. While Martin lay motionless, the argument grew, and he saw his mother break down in tears. Then his mother's patience ran out completely, her pain turned to anger, and right at that moment his mother turned to Martin and whispered, "I hope you die." These words caused the biggest scream Martin had shouted for years, but no one could hear. Maybe he even said, "I wish," to those words, but he didn't even have the ability to do that. His mother couldn't be deemed heartless, in my opinion, because death wasn't always a bad thing. And remember, his mother didn't know Martin witnessed all of this or heard her. And so the years passed, but the endless nightmare state didn't end. During these years that felt like they would never end, silent and motionless yet aware, Martin would develop his own methods not to lose his mind and not to lose hope completely. If the outside world couldn't communicate with him, he would turn inward and build a life there. While sitting in his wheelchair all day or looking at the ceiling in bed, he wandered freely inside his thoughts. What else did he have to do anyway? Sometimes he would board a spaceship and fly to distant galaxies. Sometimes he imagined the wheelchair underneath him turning into a flying vehicle equipped with rockets. He visualized escaping the room and rising into the sky in his mind. Watching the dying sunlight filter through the window and gradually shift across the room, he waited for the hours to pass. He would follow a tiny dust mote floating in the room or the movements of an ant for minutes and talk to them in his mind. Martin saw even the smallest thing he could control in his inner world as a foothold against the outer world he couldn't control. And one of the daily torments at the care home was being forced to watch the same children's programs constantly. Think about it, this was even used as torture in some places in the past. Because Martin didn't react, the staff often placed him in front of the television, forcing him to watch cartoons or kids' shows for hours. It was a symbolic situation, they just did it for some reason. And among these, a show featuring a pink dinosaur called Barney and Friends drove Martin crazy. Even though he screamed inside, "Enough already, turn this off," there was of course no one to hear him. Again, trying to guess the time by watching the position of the sun's shadows on the wall was another one of the things he could do. This way he could calculate when that day's torture would end. Knowing when the thing he was forced to hear and watch would end was a support, and this act of watching the light, which was a very rare success he could achieve, made him feel slightly better. But days, weeks, months passed and no one understood that he had woken up, that his consciousness had returned. They just couldn't understand. And naturally Martin couldn't explain. Therefore he had no choice but to hope. His situation was no different from torture. He was completely under the control of others. If his left or right side itched, he couldn't scratch it. He couldn't say it itched either. He couldn't say, "I won't lie down today," or, "I won't get up. The food is bland. It's spicy, the water is hot." None of that existed. He had become a puppet of others in his own body. And this situation wasn't just for 3 to 5 months, or 3 to 5 years. It went well past the 2000s. Yes. When the calendars showed 2001, Martin had been trapped inside his body for exactly 12 years. For years he couldn't explain his trouble to anyone and say, "I am awake, I am here." While aware of everything, he couldn't make anyone notice him. However, of course, there was a however in this story. In 2001, unexpectedly, a light of hope would appear. Verna, one of the caregivers who had known Martin for years and took care of him, did something very rare for both herself and others while attending to him. She looked into his eyes. Normally, no one looked into Martin's eyes. They didn't even look at Martin. But she must have wanted to look that day, and she realized there was a change. When she said something to Martin, she sensed that Martin's pupils carefully followed her and gave tiny reactions to certain sounds. Most people wouldn't care about these small movements. Actually, Martin sometimes had involuntary muscle spasms. But Verna saw something else. It was as if she thought Martin understood his surroundings. Then she did something that hadn't been done for years. It is such a sad thing that she asked him something that hadn't been asked for 10 years. Looking into his eyes, she asked, "Martin, can you hear me?" This question hadn't been asked to him for years. If only they had looked into his eyes and asked, maybe this situation could have been resolved much earlier. Seeing the incredible sparkle in Martin's eyes following the question, Verna's heart began to beat like crazy. Martin was present. The family and doctors were informed immediately. Martin was quickly taken to the hospital and subjected to various tests, and the result was, of course, like a miracle, hard for anyone to believe. Martin was truly perceiving his surroundings consciously and trying to react. For years he was said to be in a vegetative state, but no one realized he was suffering from the little-known locked-in syndrome. While Martin was thought to be asleep for all those years, he was actually awake. Of course, even though this was noticed, it wasn't like Martin stood up and started walking and talking. But he now had the option to learn to communicate with his eyes. In fact, people cared about him and realized he was alive now. This was much more satisfying. At first, they tried communicating with simple answers. Like look up for yes, look down for no. Even this yes-no was a perfect feeling. But soon the help of technology stepped in. Experts learning of Martin's condition provided him with a special speech device. This device detected very small muscle movements in Martin's eyes and could convert them into digital sound. Actually, thinking about it, this method was slow and laborious, but thinking that Martin could speak in some way years later was worth all the trouble. He had unlocked his body. While he hadn't been able to communicate with anyone for 12 years, now he could ask for water. I don't think it's possible for us to guess this relief. However, it was certain that good things were happening. Day by day as he practiced, speaking through the computer became a natural, ordinary skill for Martin. So, from 2001 onwards, Martin started to make rapid progress in this way, and more importantly, his development wouldn't stay limited to just communicating. Even though he remained motionless for years, he seemed to be slowly regaining most upper body functions. He began to be able to move his head slightly, and even move his arm almost imperceptibly. As such, using the computer would become easier. Because over time he would start using his right hand more comfortably, and after a while he would switch from eye tracking to a keyboard. Remembering how to read and write, relearning how to socialize, were slow but incredibly satisfying processes. After the years hidden inside, Martin was being reborn, and as I mentioned, as he developed his communication skills and gained confidence, new people started entering his life over the years. 7 years after his awakening in 2008, Martin set his sights on his sister's roommate. Just kidding, of course, but he started talking to her online. After a long silence, there was clearly much to tell. Because they talked for a year, and in 2009 they decided to get married. And thanks to this, Martin moved to the UK. Yes. This nightmare that started with a night hag story had dragged on until here. It had turned into a fairy tale. His mind had reached full capacity. Meaning, his brain functions were no longer different from anyone else's. Therefore, there were no obstacles in front of him to learn web design or start coding. Yes, he would never be able to talk in the way we know. And yes, it appears he would never be able to walk in the sense we know. But this wouldn't stop him from making his life perfect with the opportunities at hand. One more detail. Martin regained some lower body functions too. In fact, thanks to this, he and his beloved wife even had a son in 2018. That bedridden boy, who was given 2 years to live, chose life despite everything and everyone. Martin Pistorius still works in software. He lives a happy life with his wife and child. That's not all, he gives talks at TEDx. That's not all, he writes the book of his story. He experiences the feeling of being misunderstood and ignored to his very marrow. But the story you listen to, well, life is a bit of luck. With plenty of faith, he comes from there to here. That's it from me for this week. I hope you enjoyed the video. If so, please don't forget to like and comment. See you in the next video. Stay safe.